August 15, 2023. Bozeman County, Montana. Klaus Brenner watched three Hells Angels kick his German Shepherd Rex unconscious while laughing about it. They called it a joke. Rex had been his son's dog before the explosion in Kandahar took them both. What happened in the next 72 hours made the FBI's most wanted list overnight. The Montana State Police found the first biker's body nailed to a cross outside Billings. The second one disappeared entirely. Just his motorcycle, still running, parked at a truck stop with fresh blood on the seat. By day 3, the Hells Angels had called in reinforcements from 6 states. They'd never seen anything like what Klaus Brenner could do with his bare hands. They didn't know he'd spent 30 years teaching governments how to disappear people. The man who could dismantle a cartel was about to remind America why some soldiers never truly retire. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Klaus Brenner had been feeding Rex at sunset for 15 years. Same time, same spot on the wraparound porch of his weathered ranch house. The German Shepherd would sit perfectly still, ears alert, waiting for the command that never varied, Essen, mein Freund. Tonight, Rex lay motionless on a veterinary table 40 miles away in Billings, his ribs wrapped in white bandages that couldn't hide the purple bruising beneath his black and tan coat. The vet had used words like internal bleeding and miracle he's alive, while Klaus stood silent, his weathered hands clenched at his sides. The three bikers had rolled up to his property at 3:47 p.m. Klaus remembered the exact time because he'd been checking the security cameras he'd installed around the perimeter, old habits from a life he'd buried in the Montana wilderness. The Hells Angels patch on their cuts read prospects, which meant they were trying to prove themselves. Young, stupid, looking for trouble to earn their full colors. Rex had been doing what any well-trained protection dog would do, placing himself between potential threats and his handler. No aggression, no barking. Just a solid stance at the edge of Klaus's property line, watching. The kick came without warning. Steel-toed boots connecting with Rex's ribs like a Louisville slugger hitting a fastball. The Shepherd went down hard, whimpering in a way Klaus hadn't heard since Kandahar, when the mortars were falling and, "Just a joke, old man." The leader had laughed, revving his Harley. "Tell your mutt to stay out of the way next time." Klaus had counted to 10 in German, then Austrian dialect, then Pashto. By the time he reached 5 in Arabic, the bikers were gone, leaving only exhaust fumes and the sound of Rex struggling to breathe. Now, driving back from the veterinary clinic in his battered Ford pickup, Klaus felt something stirring in his chest that he'd kept locked away for 15 years. The same cold calculation that had made him legendary in Austria's Eco-Cobra unit. The methodical patience that had helped him survive 3 tours in Afghanistan. The absolute certainty that some actions demanded consequences. His phone buzzed. Text message from Dr. Martinez at the clinic. Rex stable for now. Touch and go next 24 hours. Internal injury severe. Will call with updates. Klaus set the phone down and pulled off Highway 2 into the gravel lot of Murphy's Bar. Wednesday night meant the local crowd, ranchers, truckers, maybe a few oil workers passing through on their way to the Bakken fields. He pushed through the heavy wooden door, and conversations died as they always did when Klaus Brenner entered a room. Even at 68, he carried himself like a predator. 6'2", lean muscle over a frame that had absorbed more punishment than most men could imagine. Gray hair cropped military short, pale blue eyes that missed nothing, scars on his hands that told stories he'd never shared with anyone in Bozeman County. "Evening, Klaus." Murphy nodded from behind the bar. "Heard about Rex. Damn shame." Word traveled fast in small towns. Klaus ordered a Jameson neat and took a seat in the corner where he could see both entrances. Old habits. "Those bikers still around?" Klaus's voice carried just enough edge to make Murphy glance up from the glass he was cleaning. "Last I heard, they were camping out at Miller's Creek, planning to stay through the weekend." Murphy slid the whiskey across the scarred wood. "You thinking of doing something stupid, Klaus?" Klaus lifted the glass but didn't drink. "Depends on your definition of stupid." The bar's other patrons had gone back to their conversations, but Klaus noticed how they kept glancing his way. These people had known him for 15 years as the quiet German who trained search and rescue dogs and kept to himself. They'd seen him help with missing hikers, donate anonymously to the volunteer fire department, fix broken fences for elderly neighbors without being asked. They had no idea what Klaus Brenner had been before Montana, what he'd done in places whose names appeared in classified files, the operations that had earned him decorations he'd never displayed and enemies he'd spent decades avoiding. Rex wasn't just his dog. Rex was his last connection to Sergeant Eric Brenner, Klaus's son, who'd served as a dog handler in Afghanistan until an IED turned a routine patrol into a funeral with a closed casket. The military had offered Klaus his son's working dog as a gesture of appreciation for your family's service. What they hadn't told him was that Rex had been there the night Klaus's entire unit was ambushed, the night someone with access to their patrol routes had sold them out to the arms dealers they'd been tracking. Rex had seen everything, remembered everything, and for 15 years had been the only witness to a betrayal Klaus had never been able to prove. Now someone had hurt Rex. Not by accident, not in combat, but as a joke. Klaus finished his whiskey and left a 20 on the bar. Miller's Creek was 30 minutes north, up a logging road that would be dark as pitch by the time he arrived. Some lessons required personal instruction. The drive north from Murphy's Bar stretched Klaus through landscapes that had become his sanctuary. 15 years of these same winding roads, past the Hendersons' cattle ranch where he'd helped deliver calves during the brutal winter of 2018, past the old Sinclair station where Mary Chen always waved from behind bulletproof glass, past the turnoff to Sacred Heart Cemetery where he visited Eric's headstone every Sunday after church services he never attended. Klaus had built this quiet life stone by stone, fence post by fence post. When he'd first arrived in Montana with nothing but a duffel bag and military pension, the locals had been suspicious of the Austrian with perfect English and scars that didn't come from ranch work. But 15 years of showing up when neighbors needed help, pulling Jim Morrison's truck from a snowbank at 2 a.m., teaching Sarah Walsh's kids how to train their rescue mutt, quietly paying medical bills when the Kowalski family couldn't afford their daughter's surgery, had earned him something Klaus hadn't possessed since Eric's death: belonging. The headlights cut through Montana darkness as Klaus remembered the morning he'd decided to settle here. He'd been driving aimlessly across the western states, carrying Rex and a burden of guilt that made sleep impossible. Then Rex had started whimpering in the passenger seat, the same sound he'd made tonight on the veterinary table. Klaus had pulled over at a scenic overlook 20 miles south of his current property, and Rex had bolted from the truck, running straight into the wilderness like he was chasing a ghost. Klaus had followed for 2 hours through pine forests and meadows that reminded him of the Austrian countryside he'd abandoned. When he finally caught up, Rex was sitting perfectly still beside a stream, staring at something only the dog could see. For the first time since Eric's funeral, the German Shepherd looked peaceful. That night they'd camped under stars Klaus hadn't seen since his childhood in Salzburg. No mortars, no gunfire, no encrypted radio chatter about arms dealers and missing weapons shipments, just silence and the sound of water over stones, and Rex sleeping without nightmares for the first time Klaus could remember. Within a month, Klaus had purchased the ranch with cash from accounts he'd maintained in Swiss banks. Within a year, he'd built the dog training facility that became his cover story, though the work itself brought unexpected satisfaction. Teaching search and rescue techniques to local volunteers, training therapy dogs for the VA hospital in Great Falls, working with ranch families whose border collies needed purpose beyond herding cattle. The irony wasn't lost on Klaus that he'd become known throughout Bozeman County as the man who could fix any dog's behavioral problems when he couldn't fix his own. Now, as his truck climbed toward Miller's Creek, Klaus felt the carefully constructed walls of his new identity beginning to crack. The Klaus Brenner who'd spent 15 years training dogs and mending fences was fading, replaced by the man who'd once eliminated arms dealers across 3 continents. The man whose classified personnel file contained evaluations like surgical precision under extreme stress and natural talent for psychological warfare. His phone buzzed again. Text from Murphy. Heard from my cousin in the sheriff's department. Those bikers have priors. Armed robbery in Idaho. Assault charges in Oregon. Watch yourself, Klaus. Klaus almost smiled. Murphy's concern was touching but unnecessary. The Hells Angels prospects camping at Miller's Creek thought they were dangerous because they'd robbed gas stations and beaten up civilians in bar fights. They had no concept of the kind of danger that came from men trained by governments to eliminate threats cleanly and quietly. But Klaus's amusement faded as he thought about Rex lying sedated in the veterinary clinic, fighting for his life because 3 strangers had decided his pain would make good entertainment. Rex, who'd survived IED attacks and Taliban ambushes, who'd watched Klaus's son die and somehow found the strength to keep living. Rex, who'd been Klaus's only companion through 15 years of exile, the only living being who knew Klaus's real story and loved him anyway. The dog had never asked questions about the nightmares that made Klaus wake up screaming in Pashto, never judged him for the locked gun safe in the basement or the security system that belonged in a CIA safe house, not a Montana ranch. Never questioned why Klaus sometimes disappeared for days into the wilderness when certain anniversaries approached. Returning hollow-eyed and speaking only German, Rex had simply been there, faithful and patient and undemanding, asking nothing more than food at sunset and the chance to work alongside the man he'd chosen to protect. Now Rex might die because Klaus had grown soft, because he'd believed 15 years of peace meant he could lower his guard, trust that his past would stay buried in classified files and unmarked graves across 2 continents. The turnoff to Miller's Creek appeared in his headlights like a judgment. Klaus slowed the truck and felt muscle memory take hold, the same cold focus that had kept him alive when staying alive required killing people who probably had families of their own. Some debts could only be paid in full. Klaus turned onto the dirt road leading to Miller's Creek, his headlights cutting through pine branches that scraped against the truck's roof like skeletal fingers. Half a mile ahead, orange firelight flickered between the trees, and the sound of laughter carried on the mountain air, the kind of careless laughter that belonged to men who'd never faced real consequences. He killed the engine 200 yards from their camp and sat in the darkness, letting his eyes adjust. 3 motorcycles parked around a fire pit, 2 dome tents, empty beer bottles glinting in the firelight. The bikers were passing around something that wasn't tobacco, their voices echoing off the canyon walls with the false bravado of men trying to convince themselves they were predators. Klaus reached for the door handle, then stopped. His phone was buzzing, not a text this time, but an actual call. The display showed a number he hadn't seen in 15 years, one he'd memorized but never expected to encounter again. Plus 43664 XXXXXX. Austrian country code. Klaus stared at the screen until it went dark, his heart hammering against his ribs. Only 5 people had ever possessed this number. 2 were dead, Eric and Klaus's former commanding officer, Colonel Richter, who died of a stroke in 2015. 1 was in federal prison for arms trafficking. The 4th was Klaus himself. That left Major Ingrid Hoffmann, the Austrian military intelligence officer who'd been Klaus's handler during the weapons trafficking investigation that destroyed his life. The woman who'd sent him into Afghanistan with promises of justice for the soldiers killed by black market weapons. The woman who'd vanished the night Klaus's unit was ambushed, taking her classified files and leaving Klaus to explain how their entire operation had been compromised. The phone rang again. Same number. Against every instinct screaming at him to ignore it, Klaus answered. Klaus. Hoffmann's voice hadn't changed, still the crisp Viennese accent that could make military briefings sound like Mozart compositions. I wondered if you were still using this phone. Ingrid. Klaus kept his voice level despite the ice forming in his chest. 15 years of silence. And you call tonight? I saw the news reports. American veterinarian treating a German shepherd with military markings for severe trauma injuries. The dog's registered owner listed as Klaus Brenner, Montana. I remember you mentioning your son's working dog. Klaus closed his eyes. He'd been careful about Rex's veterinary records, but Hoffmann had always been thorough. What do you want? The same thing you want. Resolution. Through the windshield, Klaus watched one of the bikers throw another log on the fire, sending sparks spiraling toward the stars. You're 15 years too late for resolution. Am I? Tell me, Klaus, the men who hurt your dog, have you identified them yet? The question hit Klaus like a physical blow. How could you possibly? Because I've been tracking them for 18 months. The Hells Angels chapter operating through Montana and Idaho isn't just running drugs and guns for entertainment, Klaus. They're working for the same cartel that purchased the weapons from our investigation. The same cartel that orchestrated the ambush that killed your unit. Klaus felt the world tilt sideways. That's impossible. The cartel never forgot about the Austrian Special Forces commander, who nearly exposed their operation. They've been waiting for you to surface. When you disappeared into the American wilderness, they assumed you were dead or broken, but then you started training dogs for law enforcement. Your name appeared in federal databases. Rex's military service record created a paper trail. You're saying they found me? I'm saying they tested you. Tonight's attack wasn't random violence, Klaus. It was reconnaissance. They wanted to see if 15 years of peaceful living had turned you soft, or if Klaus Brenner was still the man who eliminated 8 cartel soldiers in Kandahar without leaving a trace. Klaus's hands were shaking now, a tremor he hadn't experienced since his first firefight 30 years ago. The bikers are expendable. Cannon fodder sent to provoke a reaction. Correct. The real threat arrives tomorrow night. A 6-man elimination team with orders to finish what they started in Afghanistan. They know about your ranch, your security system, your weekly routine. They know Rex is the only witness to what happened the night Colonel Richter betrayed your unit to the cartel. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Richter hadn't died of a stroke. He'd been eliminated to tie up loose ends. The arms trafficking charges against Klaus's former teammate weren't random justice. They were orchestrated removal of anyone who knew the truth. Rex remembers, Klaus whispered. Rex remembers everything. The scent signatures of the cartel soldiers who killed your son. The sound of Richter's voice giving them your patrol coordinates. The location where they buried the evidence that would destroy careers and topple governments. Klaus stared at the campfire ahead, but he was no longer seeing 3 drunk bikers. He was seeing the trap he'd walked into 15 years too late to avoid. They're coming for him, aren't they? For Rex. They're coming for both of you. The question is whether Klaus Brenner dies a dog trainer in Montana or remembers who he used to be. Klaus ended the call and sat in the suffocating darkness of his truck cab, watching the bikers through his windshield like they were actors in a play he no longer understood. 20 minutes ago, he'd driven here for simple revenge. Make them pay for hurting Rex, send a message about consequences. Now those same 3 men look like pawns on a chessboard, their laughter echoing off canyon walls that suddenly felt like the sides of a trap. He started the engine and backed down the dirt road without turning on his headlights. The bikers never looked up from their fire. The drive home passed in fragments, his hands gripping the steering wheel too tight, Hoffman's voice replaying in his head, the growing certainty that his 15 years of peace had been an illusion. By the time Klaus reached his ranch, his shirt was soaked with sweat despite the mountain cold. The security system's green lights blinked their familiar welcome as his truck crunched across the gravel driveway. Motion sensors, infrared cameras, pressure plates along the access road, technology that had seemed like paranoid overkill when he'd installed it. Now Klaus realized it might not be enough. Inside the house, he went straight to the kitchen landline and dialed a number from memory. Murphy's Bar. The background noise suggested a busier night than when Klaus had left. Murphy, it's Klaus. Those bikers at Miller's Creek. How long did you say they were staying? A pause. Through the weekend, far as I heard. Why? Please tell me you didn't drive up there and do something stupid. I need you to call Sheriff Coleman. Tell him. Klaus stopped. What could he tell Coleman? That Austrian military intelligence had called to warn him about cartel assassins? That his dog was a witness to war crimes? That Klaus Brenner wasn't actually a German immigrant who trained rescue dogs? Klaus, you still there? Tell him to run those bikers' plates. Check if they're wanted on anything serious. Already did. Coleman's cousin ran them after the incident with Rex. Clean as whistles, far as official records go. Of course they were clean. Professional operations didn't use criminals with outstanding warrants. Klaus thanked Murphy and hung up, then stood in his kitchen staring at the phone like it might ring again with more impossible truths. The refrigerator hummed. The antique clock above the sink, a housewarming gift from the Hendersons, ticked toward midnight. Everything looked exactly as Klaus had left it 3 hours ago. Coffee mug in the sink, Rex's water bowl beside the back door, yesterday's mail stacked on the counter. the domestic debris of a life he'd built one careful day at a time. But now he noticed things his civilian eyes had stopped seeing. The kitchen window offered perfect sight lines from the ridge behind his property. The back door's deadbolt wouldn't stop anyone with proper tools. The basement gun safe that had once seemed excessive was positioned too far from the living areas to be tactically useful. Klaus walked through his house like he was seeing it for the first time, cataloging vulnerabilities with skills he'd hoped never to use again. The guest bedroom faced east toward the access road, good for early warning, bad for escape routes. The master bedroom had one exit and no cover from the main approach. The basement offered protection but could become a trap. 15 years ago, when he'd first walked through this property with the real estate agent, Klaus had been thinking about Rex's need for open space and his own need for solitude. He'd bought the ranch because it felt like sanctuary, not because it offered tactical advantages. Now he was remembering why soldiers didn't retire to glass houses. His phone buzzed. Text message from Dr. Martinez, Rex responding well to treatment. Vitals stable. You can visit in the morning. Klaus stared at the message and felt something crack inside his chest. Rex was fighting for his life in a veterinary clinic because Klaus had grown comfortable, because he'd stopped watching the horizon for threats and started believing that Montana ranch life could somehow insulate him from the choices he'd made in uniform. If Hoffman was telling the truth, and Klaus's gut said she was, then Rex's beating had been a test. The cartel wanted to know if Klaus would respond like a grieving dog owner, or like the special forces operator who'd once tracked arms dealers across 3 countries. Either way, they'd gotten their answer. Klaus had driven straight to Miller's Creek with violence on his mind, exactly as they'd predicted. He'd followed their script perfectly, confirming his identity and capabilities while they watched from whatever surveillance posts they'd established around his property. The tremor in his hands was getting worse. Klaus poured 3 fingers of bourbon from the bottle he kept for sleepless nights and tried to think like a tactician instead of a dog trainer. If a 6-man elimination team was coming tomorrow night, his best option was to run, pack essentials, drain his bank accounts, disappear into the American wilderness like he'd done 15 years ago. But running meant abandoning Rex. And Rex was fighting to live because he'd trusted Klaus to protect him. Klaus finished the bourbon and walked to his basement gun safe, entering a combination he'd never expected to use. Some debts couldn't be paid by running away.